Today, in part 18 of the series The Story, we study the book of Daniel as Daniel is in exile. From interpreting the king's dream to refusing to bow down to an idol. From the writing on the wall to the lion's den, Daniel shows that the future is in God's hands. Here's Pastor Seth.
He tells all of the guys who were assembled there, he said, I want you to tell me the interpretation of the dream. But so that I know that the interpretation is correct, you also have to tell me the details of the dream itself. And if you don't do that, you're going to be executed. Now, obviously, this sends a panic through all of his counselors, and they're kind of like, nobody could do that. Who in the world could do that? And yet he's very firm and stubborn about this, and they're all just like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? They see that the death is imminent for all of them. Daniel goes to the Lord in prayer. He lays out the request before God, and God tells him in detail what the dream is and what the interpretation of the dream is. And Daniel goes in the nick of time before the execution of all of the council, and he gives the dream. The dream involves a large statue, and the statue is an unusual statue. The head is made out of gold. The chest area is made out of silver. The torso is made out of, and thighs are made out of bronze. And the feet are made out of a collection of, or a mixture of clay and iron. As the statue is standing in all of its strength, suddenly a rock seems to fly out of nowhere, lands into the statue, and the statue is decimated into pieces. That's the dream. The king knows it's important. There's something here, but what is it? Well, Daniel is brought to the king. He says that, the king says, well, do you know the dream? And he says, there's nobody that can know the dream unless God reveals the dream. But the living God has revealed it to me and the interpretation, and here it is. And he lays out exactly what the dream is as the king said it, and the interpretation. Well, the king is dumbfounded by this. We pick up the story, if you're following in your handout, Daniel 2, verse 39. He talks about the first kingdom, second kingdom. After you, another kingdom will rise. This is the second kingdom, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes are partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. Just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. Now, if you studied ancient history, your mind is already churning. What is he talking about? Babylon is the world power at the time. What follows the Babylonians? The Medes and the Persians follow the Babylonians. What follows the Babylonians? The Greek Empire follows, and then the Roman Empire follows. And somebody has put together this little picture here, the picture of the statue from someone's imagination, and the essence of the four kingdoms, and then the last, the Holy Roman Empire up there. Now, Daniel didn't know, at least in here, the names of the kingdoms, but he could identify what was going to happen over the next about 500 years. It's an astounding interpretation, an astounding prophecy, as Richard mentioned. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. Now, this is the rock that comes hurtling through the air and smashes that statue into smithereens, is a different kingdom. Not made of gold, not made of silver, not made of bronze, not made of iron or clay. It's a rock. And the rock will crush all of these other kingdoms. They will be pictures of the coming and going of civilizations and powers. But another kingdom is going to start where Daniel sees that it's going to itself endure forever. That sounds familiar as well. About the time of the end of the fourth kingdom. Verse 45. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Now, this is an astounding picture of the theme we're looking at. God's story continues to march on. Daniel's little story is he is maybe days away from being executed, as well as his friends. It looks about as bleak can be. And yet in just the nick of the time, Daniel gets the vision of the dream and the interpretation of the dream. And guess what? The strongest man on earth, the world power of Babylon, suddenly is giving testimony to Daniel's God. Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. What's astounding about this is that as Daniel is standing there talking to the king, what the king doesn't know is that the tiniest of seeds stands right in front of him. Daniel. A man with a small story as a part of a larger story. And as the greater story continues, God is able to reach down and pick up any little story he wants to, any of us, and use them how he wants to. The second story happens in chapter 3, and this involves the three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are also counselors, friends of Daniel. And the king decides that he wants to put up this huge statue out on the plain, 90 feet tall, and he wants to have all of the people come out, and when the horns blow, the trumpets, that everybody goes down, face down, and worships. If you've ever seen what goes on during the Hajj in the Middle East, in Mecca, where you've got thousands and thousands of people falling down on their face and on their knees to worship. It's something of that situation. The penalty for not following the direction and worshiping this great golden statue is death. Now, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are in a quandary. What are we going to do when we're out there and the horns and trumpets blow? What can we do? What should we do? And they decide that they're going to remain standing rather than fall down on their faces and worship. Some of the men who are counselors along with them sell them out. They go to the king and say, you're not going to believe what those three guys did, which is kind of common for human nature. Somebody else's fall means I get to move up another notch in importance. They sold him out, sold the three guys out. The king goes to the three and he says, listen, I'm serious about this. When those horns and trumpets blow, if you're not down on your face with everybody else, you're going into the furnace. Now, I have never had to make that decision. All of us, if you follow what's going on in the Middle East, some of our brothers and sisters have to make that decision. There are brothers and sisters of ours that have had their heads chopped off and shot and crucified and burned to death. What would these three guys do? Standing there in real time, they make their decision. And some of the greatest verses in the book of Daniel are their response. They say to King Nebuchadnezzar, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set. The king is livid. And the next time this happens, when the three men continue to stand while everybody else bows down to pray, the soldiers come and they take the three, they take them over to the furnace, and everybody's watching what's going to happen. Sounds a lot like the Middle East today. The furnace, already hot, is ordered to be 7 times as hot as it was before. And the three men are bound, led over there. They walk up the steps. The furnace is so hot that the soldiers who escorted them are killed. The three men fall into the furnace to an obviously certain death, or so it's thought. And we pick up the story in Daniel 3:24. Then Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." And he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Guess who showed up? Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God." He wouldn't have used that phrase about 5 minutes before. Something happened through their testimony in that man's heart. "Come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. How do you explain that? Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." The scripture is pretty clear in the Old Testament. Just worshiping any god is a bad idea. A very bad idea. The third story, it's an interesting story because the next king, Nebuchadnezzar's son, has become king. This is about 40 years from the story we just read when Nebuchadnezzar, after he dies. It's his son Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is a king who is very ego-driven and very arrogant. He's very showy, loves to display his power and his wealth. And he decided he's going to have a banquet. He has 1,000 important people come to his banquet in the great palace. And he decides to do something that we would use the word flaunt. He's going to not just flaunt his wealth and his power, but he's going to flaunt his wealth and his power over the God of the Jews by using the gold and silver goblets that used to be back in Jerusalem in the temple. He's making a statement. As they're all having this great big banquet, he's looking like the big shot. Suddenly, the back door opens, and a hand floats in the room. And if it happened in here, maybe it would float right back in front of the sound booth, where just those 4 guys would see it. And maybe the hand would float over to this side of the room, and you would see it. And then it would come back across this way, and you all would see that hand. And maybe make its way down closer to the front. And all of the hubbub and all the important people and all the great show that's going on suddenly comes to a hush as that hand comes across the room, up where the king is, right in front of his table, and goes over to the wall and begins to write. We pick up the story in chapter 5, verse 5. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote, as well as the other 999 people. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Now, one of the reasons I think one of the reasons I like this story is because we have several different images or euphemisms in our English language. The writing is on the wall, means your time is up, the situation is over. It comes from this story. So scared that your knees are knocking together. That's part of our culture as well. The writing nobody can read. And everybody's trying to figure out, what does that writing mean? And there's a woman in the group that says, there is a man who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. That's as best as she knows. He could probably give the interpretation. That man is Daniel. He is summoned to the palace. He goes up to where the writing of the wall is. He stands there with Belshazzar and the king. And I'd like to pick up the story. This part's not in your handout, but I'd like to read a few verses before this, starting in chapter 5, verse 18. Daniel's offered a robe and a promotion and a gold chain. Maybe he's in midlife crisis. He could use that gold chain. He says, now keep your gifts for yourself, your rewards to someone else. I will read the inscription of the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your father. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a big shot and a world power just because he was such a great guy. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed, and whomever he wished, he spared alive. Whomever he wished, he elevated. Whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was filled up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind. His heart was made like that of beasts. You can read about that story in the earlier chapters of Daniel. And his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. There was a time when King Nebuchadnezzar acted and lived as if he was a donkey, grazing out with the other donkeys, covered in dew every morning. His mind was gone. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. He gives Belshazzar a little bit of history about his father and the lesson. And apparently, Belshazzar, this was not new news to Belshazzar. We pick up in your handout, verse 22. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles and wives and concubines drank wine from them. Not just a matter of, we needed some glassware or some stemware. They were all making a statement. Yeah, the God who used to be in Jerusalem, what happened to him? Look what we're drinking from tonight. You praise the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. Why does human nature do that? Why do we put such high value on temporal things? They're so foolish. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. This is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. And you'll notice that the inscription has the word mene twice. In Hebrew, that's emphasis. If you missed it the first time, don't miss it the second time. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And the last word, Perez. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Yeah. Imagine you were King Belshazzar. You had watched this hand come in. You had heard the recitation of your father's story. And you knew in detail what your father had done and what God had done to him. And still flaunted your arrogance and pride over the God of Jerusalem. And then you hear this message written out for not just you, but for your 1,000 guests. What would he do? You say, well, maybe he would repent. Maybe he'd have a change of heart. Maybe he'd say, oh, I've been so foolish. But he doesn't do any of that. He does what he's always done. He goes over and picks up the purple robe, as if that's important, and gives it to Daniel. He picks up the gold chain and gives it to Daniel, as if that's important. And he gives him a promotion, as if that's important. Functioning then as he's always functioned. Valuing then what he's always valued. Verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now, what's sort of written in between the lines is you'll notice a change of not just regime, but a change of world power. The Babylonians here are done. The Medes and Persians invaded and took them over. And you've got a new king, Darius, who's a Mede and a Persian. So when I think about this story, I think about judgment delayed is not judgment denied. Judgment delayed is not judgment dropped. God in his mercy gave Belshazzar all the time in the world he could have used. And even at the very end, with an amazing assortment of messages that had been given to him, he still refused to bow his heart and knee to God. The fourth story is, again, a famous story of Daniel and the lion's den. By this time, Daniel had become a rock star, and some of the fellas around Daniel, of course, were jealous of this. And the old, if I can make you come down a step, maybe I can go up a step, get your job. And so some of the guys came up with an idea. We pick up the story in Daniel 6, verse 7. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree. And here it is. This is what they tell the king. Anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so it cannot be altered. Now, this is what's called the law of the Medes and Persians, which there is no Supreme Court that can overrule or Congress that can overrule a law of the Medes and the Persians. The law is stated and has to be obeyed. The king signs this. Now, Daniel hears about this. And much like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in chapter 3, what's his response going to be? What is he going to do? If he prays like he normally does, he's signing his own death warrant. Maybe he would think, well, maybe I can just pray silently and in private for 30 days. When it's over, then I'm good. That's how we typically think in our little story. We usually don't make decisions like this based on the larger story. Why would we do that? So Daniel hears this in verse 10. When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before, windows open. Signed his own death warrant. The king, when he hears about this, is dumbfounded and sad because he loves Daniel. He values Daniel. But his hands are tied. He has to follow the law he himself signed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." And the rocks are placed over the mouth of the den. And everybody goes home for the night. Next morning, at first light, the king's back. And he yells through the rocks to Daniel, "Daniel, are you still alive?" Verse 21. Daniel answered, "O king," if I was Daniel, I probably would have said, let's chit-chat after. Can you get me out of here first? Daniel answered, "O king, live forever." And it's all about the larger story once again. "My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, O king." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Now, what about the guys who had sort of finagled their way to get this law passed? What happens to them? Well, the king was all over this. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Now, the last half of the book of Daniel, which I'm going to give just a few things about, has a bunch of visions in there about the future that would have been very strange for the people of the time to try to understand. It appears to me that, like many of the Old Testament prophecies, they were given somewhat to the people then, but mostly to people that followed, such that when the prophecy was fulfilled, we'd go, "Ooh, well, I remember the prophet saying something about that long ago." And the prophecies have something to do with what Richard referred to, the Son of Man who's going to come, which was the favorite term of Jesus Christ, how he described himself. Son of Man, meaning the human part of him, but for all of man, all of mankind. When I think about the book of Daniel, I think about that sometimes our little stories is about as bleak can possibly be, as Richard mentioned this morning. And yet, no matter how bleak our little story may be, when God pulls us up into his larger story and uses it, our story has great significance and great meaning. Sometimes we have a chance to see that in real time. Lots of times we don't. Maybe till after we're gone, which will be part of the joys of heaven. And the flip side of this is that no matter how great the little story may seem, King Nebuchadnezzar, King Belshazzar, King Darius, no matter how great that little story may seem, it's almost nothing in the larger story. Virtually upside down from how our world and how our culture views life. There is a larger story that's being told. In your handout, there's a little poem I wrote, a month or so ago, about the book of Daniel. Just kind of a fun little poem about this. There was a pastor that was flying across the country, and if you've ever flown into Denver or Colorado Springs or out of there, don't be surprised if you go through a lot of turbulence, even on a clear day. But when there's a storm raging, man, sometimes it's like being on a roller coaster. Well, this pastor was on a plane, and they were flying. I've been flying for a while, and about 10 or 15 minutes, and the pilot came on the plane. Said, we'd like you all to, if you can, remain in your seats, fasten your seatbelt, because we are going to come into some turbulence. Not uncommon to hear that. About 10 minutes later, the pilot came back on and said, we're going to suspend the operation of giving everybody a drink because we anticipate that the turbulence is going to be coming soon, and we don't want our folks caught in the aisle or you having to have drinks that are going everywhere. Everybody stayed in their seat. About another 10 minutes passed, and the pilot came on and said, we're not going to serve our dinner meal for everyone because we are quickly coming into a very large storm and very strong. We just want everybody to sit down, stay fastened in your seatbelt, and we'll do the best we can to get to the ground. Well, sure enough, within a short amount of time after that, the clouds outside the plane began to get dark, almost black. You could see the lightning flashing in the clouds. You could even hear the crackle of thunder over the roar of the engines. And that plane began to be moving, almost like you were at sea. Sometimes to the right, sometimes pitching to the left. And as they continued to make their way through that storm, there were those times that you just hate as a passenger, where it seemed like there's a great hand underneath your plane and just kind of goes, zoop, and your stomach goes, boo, and it looks like your stomach can't decide whether to exit into your right leg or your left leg. And then there's that moment where the plane just seems to go into free fall, and it just drops. And you just, oh. Now, when I was younger, I loved to go on roller coasters. I used to love the last car on the roller coaster because when we went over those hills, especially the first one, I just throw my hands up in the air and you have free fall for a few seconds. Well, that's fun on a roller coaster, but that's not fun on an airplane. And there they went. And now your stomach has gone from your right foot up into your neck. You're just holding on for dear life. Well, the pastor happened to look around, and he could tell there was fear written on every face around him, no matter how stoic people tried to be. Some people were just looking up. Some people were staring straight ahead into the seat in front of them. Some people had their eyes closed. Some people were looking down. Some people seemed to be praying. Every time the plane took a different pitch, there was kind of, oh, that went out from the crowd. It just got worse and worse and worse. Except for the little girl who was about 8 years old, right across the aisle from him on the other side. She was sitting there very calmly. She had her legs just kind of tucked up underneath her. She had a little book in front of her that she was reading. And through this all, occasionally she sort of scratch herself or turn the pages. Occasionally look up, but amidst this whole sea of anxiety, there was this picture of tranquility. When the plane finally landed, everybody burst into applause, and they scurried off the plane as if there was still some type of danger after being on the ground. And the pastor decided he wanted to talk with this little 8-year-old. Everybody got off the plane except her and him. And he said, when the plane was up there in that storm, going every which way, it didn't seem like you were afraid. Were you afraid at all? And she said, no, sir. He said, that's remarkable. He said, it seemed to me that everybody on this plane was afraid except you. And she just kind of nodded her head. And he said, why is that? Why were you not afraid? And she said to him, mister, my daddy's the pilot. And he's taking me home. In a nutshell, that's the larger story. No matter what is going on in our life, no matter what kind of turbulence we're in, no matter how death-defying it may appear, our daddy is the pilot. And he is taking us home. Let's pray together. Father, I was reminded this week that even the most difficult things of my life pale in comparison to what Daniel and the three friends had to go through. And yet sometimes life is still so hard. And sometimes it seems that the larger story may be dissipating, like the morning fog. The book of Daniel is here in the canon of the Old Testament to remind us, no matter how bleak things may look, the hand of God and the kingdom of God continues to march on, even in the smallest of stories and what seem like the most insignificant of ways. Would you anchor us this morning, once again, in the larger story?
We at Pacific Church of Irvine invite you to join us every Sunday at 9:30. You can also visit our website at pacificchurch.com.